So I want to talk to you today about this term, small data, but more the thoughts behind it and where I think this is going in terms of generating important technology for the world, as well as important problems for computer scientists to solve. I've been off and on with Keshav all day since 8 a.m., and he has stressed upon me the deep tradition of mathematics as the core discipline behind this whole campus. And so let me just deal with it right now and tell you right away that you won't see any mathematics in this talk. As I was talking to some of the graduate students earlier today about familiar things that can get in our way of making progress in our careers, whether it's the imposter syndrome or other things. You can't necessarily solve them, but you can sort of put them in a box, nod at them, and put them aside. So for all of those of you waiting for mathematics, what I might be able to suggest are these are areas that are worthy of exploration and more in-depth analysis, and it will point to some areas where maybe it will inspire some additional work. So let me start by explaining what I mean by this term, small data. And of course, by n equals me, I don't mean literally me. I mean small data as in the data that's about an individual. So it could just as well be n equals you. In a bigger context, first, there are all kinds of ways in which computation, information technologies have really transformed, are in the process of transforming things around medicine and health more generally. And we call this sort of holy grail of personalized precision medicine as what we're trying to achieve. And we hear a lot about that with respect to the first of these two pillars, big data. So the ability to do analyses across large collections of clinical records and claims records of all kind, where it's big in terms of the N, in terms of the population, in terms of the number of individuals that you're able to study, all the way from those more structured clinical records to the sorts of work that's done by folks at Microsoft Research and other places like Eric Horvitz on web mining, where you take unstructured health-related data from web fora and patient discussion groups, and where they've actually had new discoveries and findings of previously unknown side effects of medications that they were able to get just out of doing large-scale analysis across huge numbers of patient fora and patient entries. Really important, exciting area of work, and not what I'm going to talk about. A second important pillar is everything going on in the omics, genomics, transcriptomics, metabolomics, all these contexts, again, where any individual generates lots of data, but where a lot of the discovery is about being able to look at people who have a similar condition and be able to look at this detailed data across many of them. And computational techniques are essential there because there isn't a functional mapping of the genome. There's an attempt to map the genome and understand its processes in the human body just by looking at huge amounts of data. And that work is very important, will bear fruit over long periods of time, some of it sooner, some of it farther, and is another really rich area for computer scientists and for the world, and also not what I'm going to talk about. This third pillar is what I want to talk about, and I won't try to argue that it's of the same girth. Well, it can't be a pillar unless it's of the same height, so I'll say it's the same height. But it's about the opportunity to look at the data that comes from us as individuals by virtue of the fact that we all live in a digital world. So we generate digital traces in most everything we do, from when we get up in the morning and wake up to our phone's alarm clock, to whether we check Facebook or our email or our texts, to when we swipe our campus card or our courtesy card at the local coffee shop to purchase what we eat, to choose to get in public transportation or into our car, and all during the course of our day as we search and text and tweet, as we choose to play games online, as we choose the entertainment that we watch on Netflix or otherwise, as we're at home and we turn on the lights. Lots of work going on here in terms of residential instrumentation. Everything we do turns into digital traces. And so my interest is in how do we harness those data about the individual over time across many modalities and use it in a way that can inform, in a useful way, applications for people. And with a lot of focus initially on things around health and wellness, but with applicability beyond that. So let me put this in the context of in particular, chronic disease and chronic disease prevention and management. So when you're talking about chronic disease and ambulatory conditions, and why I focus on that more, is because there really is at least equal burden on what the individual does in terms of taking care of themselves and decisions they make on an ongoing basis, and what the clinician does. So the clinician is looking at feedback from the individual. They come in periodically every 6 weeks, every 8 weeks, every 6 months, every 6 years. There are a bunch of clinical tests done. They take a lab analysis. They measure your blood pressure. Depending on the condition, there are special tests done. And based on those measurements, the clinician adjusts their care plan. And similarly, the individual is told to measure their blood pressure every morning. If you're diabetic, to measure your blood glucose. If you're overweight and trying to avoid becoming diabetic, you're told to watch your diet and exercise. And if you have a source of injury and source of chronic pain and you're given pain medication, you're told PRN, which is basically take as needed. Pain is a context and a condition I'll come back to several times. It's particularly challenging and particularly problematic. It's challenging. It sits somewhere in between a physiological condition and a mental condition. People, at least in our ability to measure and understand it. We don't understand pain. We have no physiological measurement that's really precise for it, although people are starting to find correlates to it. And you can't look at one person's physiological condition and say they're at the same stage of ulcerative colitis or Crohn's or MS or rheumatoid arthritis and say how much pain they will have. Individuals experience that pain differently. It interferes with their daily lives in different ways. So it requires a different level of input from the individual. So we take data from different contexts to try to improve the feedback loops of self-care and clinical care. The clinician is diagnosing, prescribing, taking measurements, adjusting prescription, sometimes adjusting diagnosis. It's a feedback loop. The individual is reporting to the clinician, getting some kind of diagnosis prescription, given a whole set of behavioral and adherent things they need to do, and needing to manage their life on a daily basis. So the sources of these data that we and others use in part come from passively recorded data off the phone. And by and large, I'm particularly interested in passive data because it's most sustainable. Anytime you have to ask somebody something, there's just a certain amount of bandwidth that people have for answering questions. So we and others now for quite a while, we passively measure the accelerometer and the location indicators on your phone, which sometimes come from GPS, but very often you don't need to go to such a power-hungry sensor. And so we effectively have, for the first time in these last couple of years, the ability to have 24/7 activity location traces of individuals, virtually for free. We also look at the use of mobile applications. So the use of telephone and text, the use of maps and games, and the usage of those applications are also sources of interesting analytics. Some weird jumping here. And something I'll talk about even more and is more emerging work are all those digital traces that aren't just on the mobile. So our consumer purchases, the texts we use, the natural language we use in our emails and other online communications, and, for example, our consumption of entertainment. And yes, I have an interest in real sensors too. As they emerge, those real sensors that are physiological measures of concrete and specific physiological phenomenon, they're important, but I don't think they're more important than all these sources of software sensors that tell you things about individuals' state of function and their lives. So the challenge here in all of these things is to go beyond capturing these data, which by now is moved quite a bit from when we as a community started working in this space back around 2005, 2006, as smartphones emerged as programmable and connectable. To now, capture has become quite easy. It was all the challenge at the time, worrying about power consumption and programmability and the difficulty of programmability. But now the challenge has moved from capture to how do we analyze, summarize, combine, and correlate these data to turn them into anything actionable. So in the context of, for example, a rheumatoid arthritis patient, rheumatoid arthritis is an interesting condition to consider. It's an inflammatory disease, which means it has flares and remissions at irregular periods of time, but an ongoing basis. So it's different from other forms of arthritis, which just generally get slowly worse. But in any year period of time, your patient is probably in somewhat of a stable condition. In something like rheumatoid arthritis, flares emerge. You want to try to detect that somebody's going into a flare as early as possible and get tight control over that flare. Because if you let the flare get worse, then it causes more damage that's somewhat permanent to the joints, and you need to use a lot more medications to bring the flare back down into remission. So if you think about something like rheumatoid arthritis, the way in which people move around in the world, how ambulatory are they? How many minutes are they continuously walking during the course of a day? How quickly are they walking? How many hours do they spend out of the house? Are very relevant feedback measures to identify whether somebody is showing signs of a flare, and even more readily, whether somebody is responding well to medications, whether you can further decrease their medications because they are actually showing a response. So we need to move from these low-level measurements, which are easy, writing some code that measures activity and location on the phone, which by now you don't even really have to write any serious code for. There are APIs to all these things that come by virtue of advances in the Android and iOS operating systems. But turning that opportunity for using these things as behavioral biomarkers into actual behavioral biomarkers is still where all the work needs to happen. Now, it's to date, this is not about doing diagnostics. It's not about running something that looks at your activity patterns and says you have shown declines in mobility, and this might be an indication that you are developing condition X, Y, or Z. Farther in the future, when we have lots and lots of this kind of data across lots and lots of individuals, those kinds of diagnostic things might emerge. But in the nearer term, what I like about this problem domain is that it scales down. It doesn't only scale up. And what I mean by the problem scaling down is that it has relevance to individuals and it has utility, even one person at a time. Most of this work is applicable now, using these kinds of measures, to look for in-person changes, to look for response of an individual, to look for at an individual relative to their baseline. And while that is not as exciting, perhaps, as being able to diagnose from just in raw form from the data, it is very useful in terms of moving towards personalized medicine. where you don't just have a set prescription for an individual, this is how much you take of this medication for this long, or this is how frequently you come in to get yourself re-examined. You have the ability to see how people are doing and give them additional treatment when needed and less treatment when not so much. So this opportunity to look at the individual and say, does something work and how is it working, is pretty profound in terms of the opportunity to change the way we do medicine and create medical evidence. Most medical evidence now comes from randomized controlled trials. And there's a big deal about practicing evidence-based medicine. Evidence-based medicine is important, right? Because we don't know enough about the human body and disease to be able to derive these things and the efficacy of a drug from first principles. We don't have a model. We can't do it from first principles. We can only do it empirically and based on evidence. So every drug that comes out can't be used until we have evidence about its side effects and its efficacy, because we don't understand enough about the system, and that will be true for a very long time. But what this sort of approach to now that we can have individual level instrumentation is we can move from does something work on average to does it work for this particular individual. This is a slide of my colleague Ida Sim. We have a nonprofit startup called Open Health, which is not a charity kind of nonprofit, but a nonprofit as in IETF and W3C, trying to promote open architecture in the mobile health context. And I have to mention it because this is in the voice of a real doctor, right? I have a real doctor in the family, so I have to clarify that I'm just a PhD, not an MD. And as she likes to put it, when she sees the result of a clinical trial that says that 75% of the cases, this new medication is more effective than some over-the-counter medication, be it antacids, be it new antidepressant, be it a new pain medication. She doesn't know when this particular patient is sitting in front of her whether for that patient he falls into the 75% or the 25%. Now, if you're doing chemotherapy or surgery or various things that are not easily reversible, all you can do is go with controlled trials and maybe increasingly the sort of virtual trials that people hope will be generated by just getting a lot more data about people as they continue to use medications or have procedures done to them. But if you're putting somebody on a chronic medication for a condition that is not going away, so chronic conditions, by and large, do not go away. You can't, these are things for which there are no known cures. Blood pressure doesn't go away, even though, at least in the US, I think the statistics are that more than half of people who are prescribed high blood pressure medication stop taking it after 6 months. It's not because their blood pressure now went down. So blood pressure, diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, all these conditions are chronic, they don't go away. You're prescribing somebody medication for a condition that isn't going to go away, and they're going to be on it for years until some better medication comes along. Or maybe their condition gets worse. If you're going to be on it for years, why not do the equivalent of what we do sort of in web design, right? You can do A/B testing with that individual. And you can do study design that lets you try them on one medication, have a washout period, try them on another, collect a lot of data during both because it's all passive and low burden to them. They have a mobile device on them so they can be instructed on that switchover. And something that just wasn't feasible to really consider in an economical way because of the prevalence of mobile devices and because how we can infer outcomes and interpret outcomes from personal data really has the opportunity to the way in which we both generate evidence and provide care. So, big picture, the opportunity to use mobile and devices as well and small data to, with a lot of processing and sense making, to inform clinical and personal behavior has applications across a large number of conditions, and this is where there's quite a bit of work now in the field. There are explorations and studies going on in all of these, in all of these areas somewhere, certainly in the US, and I'm certain in Canada as well. So not all of this is just being explored academically. We've started to see it roll out commercially as well. One of my favorite startups, I have no financial interest in them, I'm just a fan, is a startup, a spin-off out of the Media Lab, out of Sandy Pentland's group, called Ginger.io. And they have taken these passive data measurements around activity, location, and as well as communication patterns, and they have built a model for certain conditions to help to inform healthcare systems when some patients might need some added attention and intervention. So for example, they have a system in operation now that works for type 2 diabetics. One of the complicating, when you're diabetic, there's a lot of behavior that you have to conform to keep yourself healthy. Keeping healthy is very important, because if you don't manage your diabetes, it starts to damage other organs in your body, and permanently. And there is previous literature that shows that one of the things that causes some people to not adhere to their medical regimen is depression. Not surprising to anyone who knows about, has experienced depression. And so what Ginger did is they built a model to detect onset of depressive symptoms in diabetics, with them opting in to say this is fine to do. And the nurses' system is alerted when there are signs of depression so that they get sort of a stage 2 intervention, not just coming in every 6 months to check their blood glucose levels. Another example of a favorite of mine that is available out there is not so much a commercial product as an approach. In many of these contexts, including in the one I just showed you, one of the things you're trying to understand from people is what's their affect. How do they feel? What's their mood? And there are standardized questionnaires for asking that question. And then there's PAM. If you're in this space, you're thinking of doing something in the context of mobile, and you're going to ask somebody to comment on their mood, PAM is the place to go, as opposed to a standardized questionnaire. And it's a really nice example of a computing-driven innovation. So first of all, I always like putting this up because it makes the audience smile. Whereas if I put up a 7-part question about mood and affect, you wouldn't be smiling. PAM was developed by J.P. Pollock and Jerry Gay at Cornell up in Ithaca, long before I got there. And what PAM is they culled photographs from Flickr, and they binned them into the dimensions of affect, which is positive, negative, and level of energy. And they got rid of ones that were too difficult to look at. And every time you open up PAM, or they're using it in their context where it shows up on your unlock screen, you tap on one of these images, and the images are randomized. They're always organized according to the dimensions of negative, positive, and level of energy, but which particular image shows up is randomized from this rather large set. And you just tap on the one that represents your mood. And they did a side-by-side study. It's written up from a few years ago. I can send you the reference if you don't find it, and showed that this was corresponded almost perfectly with traditional ways of measuring affect. And so I just want to put this up as an inspiration for people who are in HCI, for people who are in other areas, that even when things are not fully passive, there are new ways of thinking about interacting with people on their devices that can be quite powerful. So we use PAM in all of our studies, as do many other people. And another example I wanted to throw out there in this, still largely in what is the state of the art around largely using mobile in this space, is a system developed by Tanzim Chowdhury in information sciences, also at Cornell, called Mood Rhythm, which is a nice example of goes beyond what Ginger.io does. Ginger.io says, agree to have data measured passively, and we'll use it to inform the clinical care system. Mood Rhythm goes on to actually build a tool for the individual. So for people who have been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, one of the most important ways that has been managed, in addition to medications, along with medication, is to help people manage their daily routines and to stay on a consistent sleep, work sort of regimen. And that has been done on pen and paper for a long time. So one of the things that they did was put those kinds of tools in a nice mobile app, but beyond that, wherever they can, they use passive sensing and passive observation to help build and populate that daily routine journal and generate alerts, identify when people might be shifting in their daily schedule. So it's not just for the purpose of some clinical care. It's for the purpose of this individual who's largely having to manage their own symptoms to help to give them the feedback that they might be getting back into some irregular routines, which are going to worsen their conditions. So mobile health has evolved quite a bit. We just, in the last couple of months, it's been rather dizzying with, I don't have a slide on this, with Apple and Epic announcing, with Google and Samsung announcing. Who knows what I'll hear at Google I/O in a couple days around Google Fit. There's a lot of movement in the mobile health space. It's a slow slog to turn these things into robust and reliable medical measures, but the consumer space is moving faster. And so people interested in this space, who are interested in innovating in this space, one of my recommendations is if you can identify a way to build a technology for the consumer. Sorry, I'm from the US. We call people consumers. I don't know what you call them here. So if you can build a technology that's focused on the individual, the consumer, the patient, that they can adopt, there is much more rapid opportunity for introducing innovations. In order to get innovations to be adopted by doctors is a much slower path. Now, the second part of that advice is, when innovating for the consumer and the patient, always do it with a doctor on your team. So we try to create innovations for individuals, but with deep clinical knowledge as part of the process. So over the last year and a half or so, working in this space around mobile health, one of the things that I began to be more and more interested in was, first of all, how much of health and how much of the cost aspects of health and how much of the quality of life aspects of health have to do with behavior and with behavioral choices that individuals have. At least the data as of a couple of years ago were, again, apologies, these are US numbers, that at least 50% of mortalities, of deaths, could be somewhat attributable to behavioral choices: food, activity, smoking, alcohol. And again, numbers from around that time, that 50% of residents in the US have at least one chronic disease. Not 50% of patients, but 50% of, and those numbers are all increasing, and the age of onset is decreasing. So I became more and more interested in looking at things that have to do with the behavioral aspects of health, and I became interested in not just what's going on the mobile, in all the other digital traces that we generate every day. So, think about that condition I mentioned, rheumatoid arthritis, earlier, or somebody suffering with chronic pain. There's a real dilemma around these things because there are these long-term better behaviors that can reduce our pain or discomfort or our health ramifications in the longer term, but it's the ultimate human dilemma because those are harder things to do. Those are harder things to get us to do. They require willpower. They require thinking out into the future. They require resisting our impulses. And so things like addressing back pain with yoga and weight loss in order to reduce your pain medication, it's not that people are just weak. It's that right now, when somebody is faced with needing to be patient as a parent or be productive as an employee, taking that pain medication is going to be more effective right now. But as we've learned the hard way, opiate-based pain medications are addictive and have reduced efficacy over time. And really, it's not the long-term solution. Whereas there are other paths to at least reducing the amount of pain, but they are simply ones that are harder to take. Similarly, I think things that are more common on a university campus are issues around sleep. So you have an exam tomorrow, you have a thesis defense tomorrow, you have all kinds of things tomorrow, and all kinds of ways and things that cause us to not pursue good sleep hygiene. And not only that, it is not yet a stigmatized behavior. It's actually a fairly macho behavior to talk about how little sleep we got and how little sleep we need. I think the tides are just starting to turn on this, as there is more and more medical evidence, cognitive evidence about the problem of inadequate sleep for individuals. And there is a lot in our environment, right? Many, many generations ago, there wasn't this prevalence of artificial lighting. So you went to sleep and rose with the sun. We've gone way past that, all the way to the prevalence of screens like this that not only, as people have found, cause us to be wakeful for longer, but give us access to endless amounts of stealth, at the risk of, yes, you can laugh at what I'm about to say, although I wasn't intending to be funny. Endless amounts of self-stimulation. I was referring to Netflix. That we can get to through this. And, it used to be that television delivered its crap a week at a time, right? You had to wait for that next episode of whatever it was that television delivered. And now you can Netflix binge, right? All the episodes come out at once. And that willpower it takes to turn this off, as opposed to watching that next thing, it sounds trivial, but by the number of people smiling again, I think this probably feels familiar. So, I'm interested in taking this mobile and small data stuff and combining it as a way of trying to build applications and engagements and things that help us be our better selves. Yes, that's a little bit lofty of a goal, but that's our goal at this juncture in time. So for example, our email traces over time and the language we use in it. So email was one of the first things that got me to say, okay, Deborah, you have to move on from just being focused on mobile, because there's lots of text-based communication that happens in email. I actually started looking at email because of my father. So after he passed away, the three of us it happened relatively suddenly, his decline, and we didn't really know what was going on when his health started to fail. And it all happened through a change in his function. So in December, he had already been 90 for several months. He was still my mother's primary caretaker. He was driving, let's not talk about that. He was buying their food, he was going out to dinner, and he was doing all these things. And in March, he passed away. And it was a very rapid step function. In the beginning of it, we didn't know what was going on. But the first thing that I noticed was that he didn't answer my email. Now, you might say he was 90, and why are you thinking that a 90-year-old would answer your email? But as Dan explained to you, my parents were on the ARPANET. And email was, he wasn't exactly as much of a digital native as I was, but he answered his daughter's and his grandchildren's emails very rapidly. And I started to think back, and after he passed away and I was on sabbatical and reflecting on life and lots of things, I also noticed that, of course, there were patterns of reduced communication in his email as well. So when people start to have cognitive decline, they adapt, they use shorter sentences, they use fewer words. And so that started me being interested more generally in the patterns we might see in our emails over time, some of which just have to do with the temporal patterns, like was he answering my email as before, and some of which have to flow into doing natural language processing over that email. So we have what we call, in this sort of family of apps that we're trying to build that take in your small data and deliver something useful to you. One of them, none of these are killer apps. These are just little example apps. One of them we call Pulse. And the idea is, can you share how you're doing, not necessarily what you're doing? So also, while I was on sabbatical and while I was reflecting on life and issues around my father's passing, I got an email. I have no idea what time it is. Just occurred to me. How much time do I have? Okay. So I got an email from a woman in Berkeley who I don't know, who saw some article in the New York Times. She was 70 at the time, and she wrote to me and said, I'm 70 years old, and I've been reading about some of these mobile health things of yours. But my friends and I, we all have mobile phones, and we do stuff on the internet, but we don't download apps, and we're not on Facebook. And I have the sense, my partner passed away a couple years ago, and I have the sense that I could have seen that something was going on. And so I have an idea that, so we went back and forth in email. I've never met this woman. Since then, a young postdoc of mine has gone and met her several times. She's pretty unbelievable. But we went back and forth on this idea of, could she and a few of her friends, or maybe a family member, just have some kind of a pulse that would give them an understanding of generally how they're doing relative to their usual everyday patterns, without having their kids tracking where they are or reading their emails. Really just this question of how are you doing, not what are you doing. So one of the apps that we're building is in that context of whether it's for informal caregivers or health coaches or for distance relationships of other kinds, and those interesting balance of power between parents and children that happen first, for example, when your children go away to college, and they might even be up for having some sense of sharing with you how they are. By the way, what Dan didn't say, and maybe he did it intentionally to be polite, was that the reason I preferred email to phone, right, was not because your reason, you can't read lips over the phone, but for my reason, when you're in email, you can control the conversation. Right? So when you're calling home to your parents at 17 from Berkeley and you don't want to get involved in some long interrogation about what you're doing, right? Email was a lot more comfortable. So same notion here. Kids with medical conditions, without medical conditions, and elder parents who want to retain independence, that's this space that we're exploring by leveraging communication over time as well as physical patterns. But probably the small data source that is of greatest interest to me these days has to do with our purchases. So yes, I guess this is a function of being in a very consumption-oriented society. But the opportunity for us to see patterns and to influence patterns by having real data about what we actually spend money on is of significant interest. And probably this is of greatest interest with respect to food. So working in this context of health and such for a number of years, one of the things that's bothered me is that the big elephant, what's the metaphor? The big elephant in the room when it comes to things around health is food. And the food environment we live in and the amount of processed food we eat, and I won't get started fully down that path, but except the fact that so many of our chronic conditions are driven by very poor food environment and all the things that drive obesity and diabetes and cardiovascular disease, and even some evidence around other inflammatory conditions and some types of cancer. Yet measuring food intake is really hard. And I think measuring food intake was one of the first projects I did in mobile health. I was at my first ever NIH meeting, and they were talking about, I found out for the first time then, it was probably around 2006, that all the studies, including what I just said, that condition X is driven by eating food Y, that all of that data comes from where? How do they know? How do they know the condition X is because you eat food Y? How do they know that you eat food Y? Yes. So in the big picture, in big studies, they look at countries, and they can talk about the Mediterranean diet or the incidence of cancer in Japan, where they have big data statistics about generally what people eat. But in all other studies where they have used individuals, the data about what they eat comes from them answering questions. How many times a week do you eat broccoli? Or it got a lot better, because they stopped asking how many times a week you ate broccoli, and they asked how many times today did you eat broccoli? That was big advance called ecological momentary assessment. I tried to do something at the time, these were these Nokia phones, and we programmed them to they were outward facing. It was in parallel of the SenseCam. Had I waited, I could have used a SenseCam. But we just programmed these Nokia phones to take a picture every 10 seconds. And as the Europeans at the time were doing, put them on a lanyard around the neck and took pictures, generated images during the whole course of the day, and then used some easy computer vision stuff to narrow it down to a small sort of strip of things you'd eaten during the day. It was an interesting sort of activity. It drove our system, but it was ridiculous, because the privacy implications of walking around all the time with an always-on outward-facing camera. Remember, Google Glass is not always on. You still tell it, take a picture. Now, that might be because that's largely because they're conserving battery. But I at least didn't want to be promoting it, since I wouldn't wear it. So I wouldn't wear it at home, where people are walking around in half-clad, and it's not privacy. It's not my privacy I'm invading, it's the people around me. So I would wear it. When I got into the car, I would run it on my way to work, very long commute. All the images were of my steering wheel. And then at work, where all the images were of a piece of fruit that I would take that barely got caught, and my email or whatever it was I was doing on my screen that could all be read. So that was a bad idea. But what I liked from it is it was the first time I started generating continuous location traces throughout the day, and it actually led to doing lots of other things. Back to food. So when trying to think, finally got my head out of my mobile and started to think broader, I started looking at consumer transactions, and I think that there is a great promise in using consumer data for the individual from their purchases, from their loyalty cards eventually, to give us an opportunity to affect how people do food shopping. And that's just where we are now. It's a small piece of the problem, but the idea behind Pushcart is that if you can influence your food environment at home, by having willpower a couple of times a week when you go to the grocery store, then you and your family don't need to exhibit so much willpower the many times a day when you'll be going to the pantry or the refrigerator. So creating better food environments is what we have to do, because otherwise people have to exhibit way too much willpower to control themselves. So lots of free carbs at work, free pizza, free bagels, all those things are not helpful to our students and our workers. And having lots of those sorts of comfort food that has been designed to be addictive is not a good food environment for your family at home. But these are hard habits to change, and general advice we all know. But when we're tired at the end of the day and we're going home to get food to feed kids or others at home who are hungry and tired also, it's hard to exhibit that willpower. So Pushcart, we're starting off with online grocery shopping, matter of convenience, because online grocery shopping generates receipts, and I don't have to hassle with the loyalty card companies. So with Pushcart, we get, there's an auto forward of your email receipts that you get from the online grocery, and we create a dashboard that that a dietitian looks at. It's a Wizard of Oz. You don't ever talk to this person, but we don't know how to automate the advice yet, right? So a Wizard of Oz dietitian gives you nudges in the direction of more of this, less of that, trying to nudge you towards more produce, or really what the nature of the health advice is a modular thing. That depends on the individual. And what the nature of the behavioral mechanisms are is a behavioral thing. Carrots or sticks, that's something that's modular. But the point is to start being able to drive our behavioral tools with real data on how we actually do. So you can nudge somebody in a certain direction and see if they actually respond. The tool can actually just be there. Somebody creates better habits. It can just be there silently and notice when, because of exam periods or because of travel or the holidays or personal crisis, when people tend to fall off the wagon, decline in their habits, the tool can be there to remind them of their better self. Last June, you were up to a 70% composition of fresh fruits and vegetables in terms of the numbers of servings in your grocery cart. And here was a grocery cart that worked for you then. Sorry, I'm having trouble advancing the slides. Okay, so lots of things around chronic disease and mobile health and innovative ways of using the mobile as data and mobile as interface. Moving on to look at the behavioral components and a broader set of data and the way we can create interesting and effective feedback loops for people, because that's sort of what this is all about, because for the first time we can both measure and touch individuals continuously and digitally. So, but sort of in closing, I want to come to that I've talked about lots of conditions, lots of data streams, and a lot of these things, from multiple sclerosis to rheumatoid arthritis to migraines to depression, many aspects of the system can be reused. Pulling a number out of the air, 80% of it is the same data sources, processed in somewhat different ways, but even the building blocks for that processing is the same. The user interface is always different, and the nature in which showing how this is a behavioral biomarker for migraine requires different endpoints than for multiple sclerosis. So what we're trying to promote in this space with OpenM Health is this modular, interoperable community, the kinds of modular interoperability that drove the internet, that has not driven health IT, at least in the US at all. But since we're talking about doing new things in a new way, we're not really displacing any existing technology in this space, since for the most part, patients are just undersampled and under-instrumented. We still have some hope of making that happen. I want to just throw up a few examples of work where there is both analytical and systems work needed. One of the really important ones is in modular pipeline for stream processing. And so again, if we're going to make forward progress, we shouldn't be starting from scratch and just building siloed solutions. We should be building toolkits that let us reuse these things for all the reasons that we know that open source and community solutions are better, because they advance faster and become more robust. And so LifeStreams was a census paper and is an open source project that's getting a second iteration on implementation. And if you're interested in this space, we'd be delighted to share and have you in that community. Similarly, I referred to the email related work from a application point of view. I think it's a really interesting area for both the behavioral economics work as well as the natural language processing. So we also have an open source modular framework that lets you, that processes forwarded email, throws away the source email, but just pulls out the language features. So one of the applications we'll be doing with this this summer is for Jeff Hancock, who's up in Ithaca, who said, okay, I got my Fitbit, my wife got her Fitbit, we used them for a while, we know how much we're walking. What I really want to know is start to see and start to influence how much we're walking together, right? Can we stick to a commitment of taking evening walks together 3 times a week? And how might we motivate ourselves to do that? So an application we'll be building is going to be taking their Fitbit data and their location data, so you can detect walking times together, and then looking at language style matching across their emails. So language style matching is an existing measure of relationships between people. When you spend a lot more time with people, your language style starts to mimic or match theirs. And so again, no one of these things is intended to be a killer app, but given the opportunity that we're generating all these digital data, if we can get access to them, we can start to build some interesting work. And they can start to motivate new types of applications of new types of natural language processing and use of language processing, as well as give us a really powerful test bed for behavioral economics and behavioral psychology. So I want to really just end by saying that as a community, what I'm hoping we can do together is create an ecosystem where we have personal data APIs. The future I want to see is that when you sign up for an internet service or a utility service or a phone service or a cable service or a loyalty card, you can opt in to get access to your personal data stream. Now, that's not because people are quantified selfers by and large and are going to sit there writing R and Python code to study themselves. Thankfully, most people are too busy for that, or they might just be busy watching Netflix, but okay. Let's say what really is going to drive this are third-party apps and services that are going to run over those data to do fun and interesting things for you. So we need to get these personal data APIs defined. We need to do that in a way that's within a community. So we're hoping to work with the W3C and their new social web working group to have there be standardized APIs so that you can build apps and services that have standardized ways of accessing these data. And then to be able to move increasingly towards a world in which it's not just everything that is known about us, but that we can get access to those data streams, we can know about ourselves, and we can also have a more balanced set of what is known about us. So with that, I'll finish. Yes.
If I'm a nasty thief, I would love to get my hands on your
data repository.
Yeah. And then blackmail you.
Yes.
That you've got this terrible disease.
Yes.
That your employer doesn't want to know about.
Many things wrapped into that question. Okay, so let me take them one at a time. The easier part of it was in terms of creating where I thought you were going to stop, but I should have known that it was a more interesting question than that. So the first part of it is, are you creating a new honeypot repository by bringing all these data streams together? And I do think there is some issue there. These days, I really think about it as linked data, not replicating that data that exists out in those other services, and replicating it and having it sit someplace. But more you have OAuth or whatever is the authentication of the time, allowing you to link. The value of linked data is that you can revoke that link, and it is, to the extent it's in the interest of the entities that capture that data, they have legal responsibility, all sorts of other things. It's not the same thing of creating the honeypot. Okay, so that's not the question you asked. It's a question I get asked, and I wanted to answer it. The harder question of having employers know things is a really deep and important one, and that doesn't start or end here. But it's a good example.
If I lose this machine,
Okay.
my whole life is out there.
Right. So first of all, for the most part, I'm not talking about new data. These are all existing sources of data. But now with the inferences made on them, I'm creating derived data that is at risk. So derived data that is clinical is stored in HIPAA-compliant clinical servers, which are as...
So it's not stored on my...
No. Thank you. I don't, that starts early with mobile. We don't store anything for very long on the mobile device, because I consider the mobile device as something that you drop in water puddles and toilets and, gets taken from you and other things. It's not a robust place to store anything. you could store it on the device and encrypted. It could be in the cloud and encrypted. Different people have a different feeling about what should be where, but it should be in a private container in the cloud. Again, I don't think we should create honeypots by replicating all this data necessarily in one place. I think we should link to data, but derived data should be, we should, as a community, create initiatives where we have private containers in the cloud that can't be mined by anybody. So, and there are a few commercial efforts that have emerged that have terms of service that read like that. Moves is not one of them. How many of you use Moves? Not that many. We were starting to say, oh, great, we can throw away all our own code around activity and location tracing that we'd been doing for a long time because Moves is a commercial app that does that. And we were starting to use it in different patient experiments. But then they were purchased by Facebook. So that would mean that every time I go and sign up a rheumatoid arthritis patient, if they're already using it, fine. But if they're not, I'm saying in order to participate in the study, you have to share your every moment's location and activity with Facebook. So there's nothing that is inherently, that I'm saying, is evil about Facebook. It's just what those data are used for is very different from what your clinical record system are used for. So this is of concern, but it doesn't just start here, right? And it is of concern to your employer. And that's about genomic stuff as well, right? It's become quite popular for people at conferences to stand up and talk about their 23andMe data, that they just had their 23, well, they did before the whole thing was brought into question by the FDA, but people would talk about, you know, I sent in, they would not brag about, but that this is the new modern thing to do, is to get your genomic analysis and know what you might have risks for. That by itself is problematic, right? Because what a coincidence that they all would stand up there and say, and I was so relieved to find out that I did not have the marker for Alzheimer's, right? They didn't stand up and say, or the next person didn't stand up and say that they did. How is that not going to influence your decisions about hiring, promotion, selecting a co-founder for a company, right? We have a lot of problematic ethical space here. This touches on it, but it isn't the only thing. Yeah. Yes, good. I'm glad you gave me the opportunity. All of it. Exactly. But the point is to get it, so it's, sorry if I didn't make that clear. It's all being collected and it's all being analyzed. Fine. But it isn't actually available to you to analyze for you. It's analyzed for improving the system, for targeting their inventory, for targeting advertising. And so this isn't new types of data, that's the whole point. But there isn't one place to go, and what Dan is saying is there isn't one place to go to get the data that describe you. And we could be increasing the hazard by creating one place to go where I collect all of the data about me. So we need to move and lobby and encourage for having personal data APIs. Now, I don't think Google and Facebook, the dominant players in the market, are the first ones incentivized to do this, although Google has various data liberation things going on. But if you talk to the carriers and the cable companies and the loyalty card companies, you're not asking them not to use the data. You're not asking them to give away their secret sauce. It's just opening it, even under regulation, the one entity to whom the common carriage is allowed to give the data back is to the customer. And if we write applications and start doing interesting things with these data, there's no downside. There's even customer loyalty and useful things for all those entities who are not Facebook and Google. So aside from there being utility in some of these things around health and wellness and other things. So I think it's a future we can realistically create, but I can't say deterministically will happen. I don't think let me answer just one part at a time. I don't think it's so much about the person. It's about creating effective and convincing and engaging interface for it. People who don't want it at all, it's not going to happen. But there are a lot of people who would like to change their habits, and it's hard. So how do we make it more engaging and sustainable to do it? So if it comes off as a nag, it won't help. If it comes back as actually small executable steps that are particular to you, that's the only way that most people change their habits. You know, if only that would be the case. For the most part, when you talk about doctors in practice, for the most part, all they say is, I don't have enough time to deal with the information I have as of now. What am I going to do with this? There's no, evidence around it. You get some, I would say, more enlightened doctors who would like this. And again, I'm not suggesting this as part of a police state approach, but lots of people who would like to be able to approach better habits and to get beyond what they know they should do to what they can do. There's my last overly long part of this answer, but there have been studies both in the context of online grocery shopping actually and video orders and such that there's something called construal theory, I think that's what it's called, which is that what we plan to do is often better than what we do impulsively in the near term. And so what a woman, Katie Milkman at Wharton, I think, studied, or UPenn, studied online grocery shopping orders and saw that the percentage of should items versus want items was consistently higher in things that weren't being purchased for right now. So the opportunity to help people act on their should and their better selves rather than their impulsive things, just an opportunity to build those kinds of tools. Neat. Yeah, and hopefully if we can turn it into an actual API so you could get programmatic access and not just a PDF. Neat. Fantastic. Yep. Yep. What are you saying? P? Okay, great. I'll look it up. Thank you. Keshav.
We have time for one more.
Okay.
What you're sensing here, what I'm sensing here is this whole opposition between regulatory or governmental intervention, as Ian mentioned, versus a corporate angle. Right now, the companies have both the means and the motivation to collect the data and silo it
Yep.
for their own purposes. Whereas when there is unlimited government, so what do you think is the role of regulation? Is it necessary? Is it good enough?
I would like to see, in the U.S., again, that's where I'm from, so that's all in the U.S., we have limited bandwidth available for the R word, right? How much regulation? If I had to take my little bit of bandwidth around regulation, I would put it on around third-party use, around data. I wouldn't necessarily regulate on this, just in the scheme of what's important, right? That people would have some more information and control over third-party use of data, because you mentioned the R word. In this space, I don't know if by the time we created the regulation it would be the right one. In this space, I'd like to drive it from, there are a lot of companies who are not Google and Facebook. And they're to some extent motivatable. We can motivate them now because they're not Google or Facebook. And they're searching around and looking for, I heard recently that USPS, UPS, one of those, is looking at possibly creating being a data store for individuals. So this isn't really hurting anybody. It's not undermining the use of big data. It's not undermining market models and such. And so I think with enough good examples of apps that could happen there, right? We saw it with the App Store and iTunes and things like that, that there's good evidence that if we get creative about doing things with it, and we don't need every bit about you, we can have one that's sort of from your residence, whether it's the cable or your utility box, and one that's around communication, that we can create an ecosystem that would move this along. And the Fitbits and the like are all accessible through APIs. So I don't think we need regulation. I think we need activity and showing positive both commercial and social plays in this space. I think that will just move things faster on this space. We need regulation when it comes to third-party data use. Yeah.
So I'm just asking, do you think, because the value of n is equal to me, it has to go hand in hand with the big data?
No, it will be more powerful then. When we generate better models that come with big data, we will be able to generate even better apps for you. But we can generate, because you can look at relative to baseline and changes over time, things that are just much easier than the big N. I also don't want the answer to be yes, because that will mean things are going to take a really long time, and I don't know how to scale the problem down. So I am biased to tell you that the answer is no, so that we can get started building and using small data apps. Otherwise, it's going to be a very long time till we have the big N.